We are now going to move across the country to the East Coast and cover Atlantic Canada. Up first is Doug Lionais from Cape Breton University, who's going to provide some insights from PEI and Cape Breton. And
okay, thank you, Heather. I'm going to stand up because it works better for me. So this, as Heather mentioned, this this follows on nicely from Sarah's presentation before the break, because we're looking at the experience of the source communities for workers to the oil sands in Cape Breton and PEI. I just want to note that in the program, it was myself and my colleague Christina Murray who are listed. We did a late-minute addition of Chloe Donatelli, who I believe is online. I saw her name pop up earlier there, who is one of our students in the MBA program at Cape Breton University. Graduated now. But I added a few slides based upon her independent work. She worked for us on our project as well, but she had some interesting findings of her own research project in the MBA program. The project that we're working on is a short-funded project called Tale of Two Islands, which is looking at the experience of, in particular, the intergenerational impacts on families of mobile workers. So what we did, there are two sites of research at Cape Breton and PEI. We did interviews with 10 families, 5 from each region. And in each family, there was at least 3 members of the family interviewed. So the commuting worker, the commuting parent, and we're looking at families, so there had to be children at home under the age of 18. We interviewed the commuting worker, we interviewed the home spouse, and we interviewed another generational member of that family who takes care of the children. So usually a grandparent, but we're open to aunts, uncles, those types of things as well. And there's a number of key informant interviews that is going to inform this as well that we looked at. And then Chloe's work, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, she did a series of key informant interviews in the business community. All right, so let's see this work. So when this panel is being put together, Kelly and Heather put together a format that we're supposed to follow, and I just do whatever I'm told. So I'm following their format more or less. So I'm going to talk a little bit about impacts, and then we're going to talk about community responses, and then some issues for further research. But just in terms of impacts, this is what I'm going to talk about: the economic impacts, family impacts, impacts on service providers, and then look at some of the work that Chloe did on local labor markets. Just in terms of economic impacts, as Kelly was mentioning earlier, it's quite difficult to get stats on this, particularly at the local level. So we did dig up a few stats. These are quite dated now. You can see almost 10 years out of date. But they give you at least some sense of the scale we're talking about here in some of these communities. And again, we're working on a project hoping to get better and much more up-to-date data here. So just looking at Cape Breton as a whole, the whole island of Cape Breton region, the number of people who are employed in Alberta, not necessarily in the oil sands, but most of them would be in the oil sands. The number of people employed in Alberta was 6.7% of the employed labor force. And PEI was much smaller, 2.5. In terms of aggregate earnings, those workers in Cape Breton were bringing home 8% of all earned income in Cape Breton in 2008. Now, certainly we would have seen this spike quite a bit higher by 2014, and then a bit of a decline since then. And then just to put this in context, Cape Breton, our history is steel mining and coal making. This represents, in 2008, about the equivalent number of people working and a bit of a higher impact in terms of income as the coal mines would have in both the early 80s, mid 80s. So at a time when that was a dominant industry in Cape Breton, this has really kind of replaced that as the dominant industry now. So let's look at impacts on families, which is really the core of our research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the people in the family and the relationships that we have to have there. So first off, looking at children, we did not interview children simply because it was a 2-year study and we didn't want to go through the research ethics of interviewing children. But it's something to do in the future, perhaps. Certainly having children present really was a significant in terms of what the experience of families. It just really complicates things. Children complicate things anyway, but it complicates the pressures that people are under. So when we talk about these impacts, we often sort of glorify the horrible, right? So it's all the bad things we talk about. For families who didn't have children, based on some previous research, they often quite liked this. It was fantastic. It was good income. The women were quite happy that their men were away for a while. They could be independent. And when they came back, we'd have comments like, "We go on honeymoon every 2 weeks," kind of thing. So for some people, this kind of work arrangement really works. But when you have a family, it's more problematic. And with children, and the impacts the parents would talk about in children is that the age is really dependent on how they were able to handle it. So if there was younger children, they would sort of demonstrate behavioral problems more often. Older children would sort of kind of internalize it and quiet up and kind of button up, but the sense was that there are still issues that they're having. Impacts on the commuting parents. Again, so it's this process of always being on the move. Disassociating from family and community life, you're missing those important dates, missing birthdays, Christmas, Easter, all those types of things, and increasingly becoming disassociated, becoming distant from community. And even when you get home, if you're on a 2-and-run rotation, 2 weeks on, 1 week off, you're home for 5 days. Those 5 days at home really get eaten up by obligations in the home. So the opportunity to volunteer, the opportunity to keep up friendships, the opportunity to sort of be part of the community really decreases even on the home rotation. So people were talking about feeling quite socially isolated there from commuting parents. From the home parents, there again is sometimes this sense of independence, of learning to be much more independent, but of course a lot more stress. And a lot of respondents talk about the idea of it feels like they're a single parent, and they are have all the responsibilities of the household and all those typical gender divisions and so forth. But it is also quite isolating for parents at home that they because they have all this extra responsibilities, they can't engage with community as much either. They're volunteering, they would report go down, they can't keep up connections with friends and so forth. And so we had a number of people reporting to us that they felt that they're dealing with mental health issues, physical health issues at times, and so forth. And then we can look at the relationship between the spouses, right? And then how this distance and this mobile work put strain on that. So there was certainly, most people would have talked about stress there. Many talked about feelings of mistrust, like, well, what's going on when he's out there? Or again, the opposite, what's going on when she's home alone. There's a mini cottage industry now of private eyes keeping tabs on husbands and wives when the other's away. And a couple of people talked about that. And then there's this issue of how the families are becoming restructured in terms of what roles people play in the household and how they play them. So again, it's typically male work. So the male commuter often feels as simply as the breadwinner, that they're there to make money and they don't really have much interaction, and the spouse at home feeling like the single parent. And then looking at grandparents, and this is really one of the interesting pieces of our research is the impacts on the grandparents of those families. And the most common comments were how people were nearing the end of their working life or into retirement. They're expecting this is the time where, they get to rest, relax, take up those hobbies they like. It's time to be cared for rather than being a caring person. You have to care for someone else. And that all gets reversed, right? Because as their children start engaging in mobile work, they have to take care of the grandchildren. And that becomes more of a demanding piece of their work. And then interesting, when we did our our focus groups, a number of people came together for the focus group of looking at talking with grandparents, spoke a lot about how they were dealing with addictions coming back. So their children would go to work in the oil sands and come home with addictions. So now they're having to deal with their children are being addicted, but having to go through taking over essentially full-time care for their grandchildren because the parents are no longer able to do that. So that's a bit on families, on service providers. We talked to a number of people, and the key ones that came out was healthcare providers. Healthcare was really difficult for for people who are traveling back and forth. The consistency of service, if physiotherapy, so a lot of the work is demanding work, there might be injuries. So how do you give proper physiotherapy rehabilitation when somebody's only home for a week or 2 weeks every month, or they're on a rotation of 2 and 1, 2 and 2, whatever it is. So the service that you're providing is always getting interrupted. And that became even more difficult when they're talking about addiction. So people who are on a methadone treatment, the service providers at home are having to negotiate across interprovincial boundaries to make sure that the methadone is being doled out both in Alberta and at home. And it's really, but you can't miss those doses. It's very dangerous to miss a dose. So it became an extra burden for those people working home. And then, of course, just the whole idea of scheduling, right? So if you need a health procedure done, oftentimes you schedule that months in advance. And as a worker, you don't know what your work schedule is. You don't know what your rotation is yet. And so they're often, having to cancel these scheduled things that they keep on getting put off and off and off and off again and again. Again, we had, counselors talk to us about how do you provide couples counseling when one part of the couple's not there, right? They're Skyping in or something like that. It becomes very difficult to provide these services. And then in education, we talked to teachers, and they saw again behavioral changes, particularly during times of transition, days when the father's coming home or days when the father's leaving. You see a lot of behavioral changes those times. And then one of the key ones that we were talking to a sort of an industrial arts instructor at a high school, and his comment was essentially that the imagination of the kids in his class was 100%. All the kids, their only imagination was they would go to Fort Mac and make money. They had no clue what kind of trade they wanted to pick up. They didn't know if they wanted to be, a laborer or electrician. All they knew is they had to go to Fort Mac, and that'd be their job. That's their career. So it's very limiting of the imagination of what future careers possibilities might be in graduating classes. So let's looking at service providers. And this slide here, we're going to talk about local labor markets. And this picks up on one of the questions from the previous session. You asked a question in terms of how does the engagement in mobile work in the community, how does that affect local business in the local labor market? And so what we're seeing, and this is the work that Chloe did on her own. She spoke to a number of different people in the business community. And what came out of there was that the sense that labor markets are entwined but asymmetrically. So of course these source communities are providing labor that is needed in the oil sands, but there's all kinds of these fall-on impacts at home. So some of the common ones, competing with wages and benefits, right? So you have this a labor shortage in these host communities, despite the fact that there's very high unemployment rates. So for particular skill sets, and even for unskilled work, taxi drivers. There was at the time where it was hard to get taxis in Cape Breton because everyone is leaving to go work out west as casual laborers. And so the employers at home are constantly competing with both the wages and the benefits of the oil companies in Fort Mac. And being unable to do so, right? And that was particularly troublesome for so companies that were sometimes entrepreneurial companies. They want to start up, they want to create a business. Oftentimes it'd be people who are doing the work back and forth. They want to come home, they start their own business, they see the opportunity for it, but they can't get their workers. So what might have been a business employing 5-6 people ends up being a one-person sole proprietorship, one person working there. So a much smaller scale. So they could have grown, but they restricted their growth because they're competing with the labor markets in Fort Mac. And then the last point there is looking at the black market and competition and downturn-driven competition for local entrepreneurs. So, and again, this is one of these sort of vicious circles here that someone in a trade might be, have their own business locally, electrical trade or something like that. They'd be providing their business, but the guys who are out coming back and forth on their week home, they might offer some black market stuff under the table. So the local businesses are competing with the tradespeople who are coming home and doing work on the side under the table, often for, again, much lower prices. So they can't, so they're the business people of the local community are getting squeezed on both sides. They can't get the workers, and they have to compete with the wages out west. And then even if they do get that, the people coming out west are undercutting them under the table for the local work anyway. And so they would end up just getting out of it and going out west themselves, right? So there's been a number of the business groups talking about this. And then downturn-driven competition. So when we see, as in 2014, 2015, when the oil price went down and work dried up out west, a lot of those people will come home and start their own businesses, again, competing with some of the people who have been there for quite a long time. So community response. So we were asked, well, how has the community responded to it, and has there been a community response? So I've got a short answer, a medium answer, and a long answer. My short answer is no, there's been no community response. That not much that we can see of, right? The second answer is, well, we're not really sure, partly because that wasn't really part of our research plan, so we weren't really looking for that. So maybe my quick no is not the best answer. And then if we really scratched, we said, well, yeah, there are some responses, but they're not coordinated, they're ad hoc, and they're really coming from the bottom up. They're not coming from municipal governments, not coming from health agencies or those types of things. For instance, the focus group I mentioned earlier, and we're talking to grandparents, that came out of those grandparents that were talking about their children who become addicted while working out west. They had formed their own support group, and it was essentially the support group came and said, well, we'll be a focus group for you. We want to talk about this. And so those parents of addicted oil workers had created their own support network, but it weren't linked into any formal supports of any sort. And then finally was the question of, well, what future research do we see coming out of this? For me, I think really the big question is, well, what's the future for these source communities? As Heather talked about earlier, they are becoming dependent at a distance. They are, again, single industry towns, just the industry is no longer there. And so what does the nature of this particular form of being a single industry town mean as we go through the next transition, as the mega projects start to dry up, and which they are in Canada? What is the future for these places? How will they continue? Will it be a continue on of mobile work, looking for work in more and more distant places, or what else might happen? Again, I think there's more work to be done on the local labor market piece. I mean, the cycles of local labor markets with price fluctuations, the tensions within it, and again, this idea of path lock-in. If a significant portion of the workforce is engaged in mobile work, does that lock in a community in terms of their imagination? And again, thinking back to those high school graduates of what kind of work will they think of in the future? And then finally, again, focusing on the families, we've taken a snapshot in time. I think it'd be really interesting to do some longitudinal analysis of the dynamics of families that are involved in mobile work. So I think I'll leave it there and open it to discussion.
We are going to move on to our next presentation, which will be Kelly, and she's going to provide a bit of a broader overview of some of the major themes that are coming out in the community impacts work in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then Leanna and I are going to follow up with some specific examples in some of our case study regions of those impacts and some of the responses. So hopefully we'll go for the next 30 to 40 minutes-ish, and then have plenty of time for some more discussion.
Great. Thanks, Heather. So the title says emerging findings, and they really are that. So I want to start out by saying that we've been working on data collection around community impacts over the last couple of years in Newfoundland. The Newfoundland Labrador team and some of the other teams have had a longer. Sarah talked about her 10 years of research in Fort McMurray, for example, on some of these questions. So I would say our finding, well, we're still doing analysis, and it's still very much more emergent than some of the others. The other thing I wanted to say, and Sean talked about this morning about how mobility is not new, and that's certainly the case in Newfoundland and Labrador. One of the first things that we talk about this increase in mobility, and people will say, "Sure, we've been doing this forever." And we always went to Labrador fishing, or people worked in forestry all around the province. So that's something that we often heard from people. This is just part of how work is here in our province. It's ingrained in the Newfoundland Labrador culture was one quote. And that also varies according to region by region, the types of mobile work. So yes, people might have been involved in mobile work, but different kinds of mobile work. So here's a quote, Terrenceville and Keels have a high proportion of oil workers. There's a community and culture of men leaving for work. There are areas on the southwest coast, for example, where women have gone to Nova Scotia to work in home care, for example. Areas where people have gone to work in the lake boats in Ontario. So a culture of mobile work, but with variations region by region. So we're trying to be sensitive to some of those variations as we do our analysis. We're also part of the Newfoundland Labrador team within the overall project is larger than the other provincial teams. And we have people, sub-projects, if you will, looking at different sectors within the province. So we have people looking at Bell Island and ferry workers, as well as other workers who rely on the ferry for getting to work on Bell Island, just outside of St. John's. We have people looking at the nickel processing sector. You'll hear more about that, Heather, in a moment. Oil and gas, construction, fisheries, and also Nicole Power speak a little bit about her work looking at youth and apprentices specifically. And then our talk here today is primarily about community impacts and responses, our team, but we are also drawing from the other projects, so it's important to point that out. So I've listed a number of our community impacts team members here, so that there's quite a few of us, and also I should say that we are drawing from the work of others, so really the community impacts team extends beyond this group to the other team members as well, and in particular aspects of Key Stories Online, I believe, and he's certainly been involved in our work in both Deer Lake, working with Leanna, and the Long Harbor piece, and Doug May, who's worked with us on the economic impacts work. So there is a large team of people who have been working on this. And the photos show some of our adventures, flat tire coming. We went to Long Harbor, and one of the things people talked about was the pressure on infrastructure and the roads, poor state of the roads. And sure enough, we got a flat tire leaving from doing our community meeting in Long Harbor on the way back to St. John's. So that's interesting. We've primarily been doing our work around the Avalon Peninsula. So you see St. John's there. And the isthmus of the Avalon is referred to here between the Avalon and the rest of the island of Newfoundland, and the Burin Peninsula down here. And there's been some interviews here on the southern shore. That said, we have had some targeted case studies for particular reasons in other areas within the province. What have we been doing? We've been looking at the interviews that people in the other sector teams are doing to pull out some of the community impacts and responses information from those interviews. We've also been conducting particular interviews related to community impacts and responses, often with key stakeholders, whether it's non-government organizations, municipal leaders, etc. And we've also done some targeted surveys in particular areas. So you'll hear more about that from Heather and Leanna, but we've done worker surveys in the nickel processing plant. We've done household surveys on spending and on housing as well, choices to determine differences between mobile and non-mobile, or less mobile perhaps, workers. And we're also doing engagement activities from the beginning of the On-Move partnership and continuing on. We're going and visiting these regions and having dialogue about what we're hearing and about what the issues are, and getting responses from people. We did have a forum particularly on the housing issues. It has been one of our dominant themes in April 2016. So that report from the Housing Forum is available online if anyone is interested. So far, we have 116 interviews in our in vivo database, and there's more coming in because the field is still going on. We do hope to be wrapping that up by the end of the year. But and 62 of those interviews are coded to date. This just shows you a map of where those interviews were completed. I mentioned a couple of other case studies outside of the Avalon area of interest. This one is Deer Lake area, the West Coast, and you'll hear more from Leanna about that. And the other is Labrador. We've done some work in Labrador as well that Heather will tell you about. It's a mix of workers and service providers in those. So some of the interviews that come from other teams are worker interviews, whereas most of our team interviews are focused on community leaders and service providers. So the main thing I wanted to start out with is just telling you what some of the dominant overall themes are cutting across everything that we've looked at so far. And then Leanna and Heather will talk about some specific case studies and more examples of these things. The most dominant theme so far is spending. So we're sort of grouping things according to economic impacts and social cultural impacts, and then policy and planning, infrastructure and service as well. So economics is dominant overall, and spending has been the most common topic discussed among the interviews so far in our analysis. Second is family dynamics, which is interesting because it was sense of place when we were in January, when we had the last time we looked at this. So the intersection between family and community is really coming up more and more as we continue to look more into the data. Housing is a big one, certainly employment, but sense of place is also important. And that came up, the question Sally raised, the question of identity and how do people feel differently about their communities, or how does the presence of mobile workers in a community change how the community feels, how people feel about their community. Those things are coming up as well, certainly as strong themes in our work, as is the income of mobile workers and the differences between incomes of mobile workers and those that are not engaged in long distance commuting. Before moving on to talk about some of the case studies, I just wanted to talk about one of the other teams, Nicole Power, who, as I mentioned, is doing the Youth and Apprentices piece, and I think she's online. So if she wants to add anything to this, she can send in a note on the chat. Has done a paper on some of her findings related to skilled trades training and apprentices, and particularly youth getting into the trades. And she talks about, first of all, our reliance on these industrial mega projects, and then and I think speaks to Doug's point about the way people are kind of trained to think about a particular kind of career, and in many cases in our young population, it's been about getting into the trades and going to Alberta, but now also things like the Muskrat Falls project, which is one of the reasons why we ended up doing some work in Labrador. That a lot of people are not working in Alberta necessarily anymore, but they're working in other large industrial mega projects. And we have a whole education system as well that's built up around that. There's the contradiction that comes out that the industry claims there's labor shortages, but then skilled trades workers claim that they have trouble finding jobs. So there's some issues there that Nicole's been looking into. Also, the point that apprentices are even more mobile, perhaps not some other mobile workers, and that they're moving for training. They're moving back and forth from work site to work site, not always to one work site, but to many different work sites, trying to accumulate their hours, which discourages them from being able to have a home base in a particular community where they're working anyway, and maybe encourages more of this mobile work from a particular source community rather than moving to a community where they might be working. People talked about the cost of housing being inflated in host communities, and we certainly heard a lot about that, which means that young people can't afford to move to a community where they might be working, even if they should want to do so. Also, her findings speak to the marginality of youth, the difficulty of youth trying to get into some of these jobs due to the labor market, but also some of the policies of both corporations and apprenticeship certification schemes and those kinds of things. But despite all of these difficulties, but also their desire to get into some of this kind of work, young people are also talking about their attachment to place and saying that they'd rather stay in their community if possible, but they're forced to go away. So one of the point that Nicole makes here is that we also often hear people talk about, well, the young people don't want to stay, or we have a hard time retaining and attracting young people to our community. There are a lot of young people saying that and speaking to the policy of trying to get people to stay that Sean was speaking about earlier, that in her interviews with young people, Nicole's been seeing that there is certainly a desire of a good portion of young people to want to stay in their communities if the opportunity should be provided to do so. I think I'll quickly touch on a few things, and then the case studies will really illustrate these. We've heard in host communities conflicting things about business development opportunities, and you'll hear more about that from Heather, particularly, I would say. But we also heard that from Doug, for example, about how workers, local employers are having trouble competing, for example, with some of the larger employers. That we heard that in host communities as well. There's a lack of the right kind of skills, so this tension that exists between in host communities where there's all kinds of jobs available, but local people might not be able to avail of those jobs, and then that creates some tensions in the community as well between the incoming workers and the local community. Lack of taxation opportunities, that came up in Sarah's talk about not being able to tax mobile workers or the employers who are bringing mobile workers in to try to help make up for the pressure on services. And I've spoken already about lack of local employment opportunities. On the social cultural side, people are talking about the changing dynamics and character of their communities because of, in part, certainly because of the commuting worker. Concerns about the impacts on the types of housing, on the affordability of housing, and what that means for vulnerable populations particularly. Concerns about volunteerism, we've heard about that from other speakers as well, and saying mobile workers come in, they may be providing certain kinds of financial benefits, but they're going out as a source communities, but, and they may be sending money home, but is that enough? So some of the issues that have already been discussed about, they're not there to spend time with their kids or to help look after the grandparents or to volunteer. Planning and governance. We basically, I think we're seeing a theme here, but that's one of the things that's standing out for me in the presentation so far, is that there's been some kind of ad hoc, as Doug said, responses, but not a lot of coordinated attention to the impacts of mobile work and discussion about some of the potential responses. We certainly are seeing the same thing. There's been some attempts in host communities to respond to issues related to mobile work, very limited in source communities. When we ask municipal leaders about how many people are working away in their communities, what has that meant for their communities, I sort of feel like we get a blank stare a lot of the time. I don't know, there's a lot of people, don't know how many, haven't really thought about how it's affecting our community, you know, those kind of responses. So that's interesting. And it sounds like others are hearing similar kinds of things. So there's some thought about how to respond to lack of volunteers, for example, by looking at regional solutions. So certainly I think the mobile workers is a driver behind some of the push for regional services in Newfoundland and Labrador. But generally, people talking about really inadequate amounts of planning with some sporadic examples. One is in Deer Lake of a family resource center that does have a program for mothers whose spouses are away with young children, for example, but those are they're few and far between. In host communities, there's been some recognition of the fact that host communities often aren't getting the benefits that they think they should be getting from the resource developments in their communities, and that they are ill-equipped to do so. So there's been something called Small Towns, Big Industry, which Heather will probably touch on. Some efforts to try to pull together small communities facing these kinds of challenges to try to increase their ability to respond to large projects and the in relation to that, mobile workers. But they're, I would say, in their infancy, those efforts. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. So we'll hold questions until after some of the case study regions. And next up, we've got Leanna, who I think is going to take us to the Buren and Deer Lake.
Okay, so I guess I'll start with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Sandra Butters. I'm a master's student with the Environmental Policy Institute at Grenfell campus, Memorial University, and I'm a trainee with the Community Impacts component of the Newfoundland and Labrador component of the On the Move Partnership. So I'm going to be talking to you today about two case studies. The first is the Buren Peninsula, and then the next is my own thesis research looking at the town of Deer Lake. But we'll start with the Buren. The area is highlighted here on this picture in the map. It is very dependent on mobile work, as I understand, in the island. It's one of the most dependent regions. And so, kind of just going over methods quickly. I'm not going to delve too deep into this because Kelly gave a really good overview of the types of methods that the community impacts component is using. But we have conducted interviews with key informants and mobile workers in the region, in addition to a door-to-door survey specifically on spending. And the analysis is ongoing. We're doing a thematic content analysis with NVivo, as well as some descriptive statistical analysis, which hasn't started yet, but we have the survey data in an Excel spreadsheet now. Okay, so we'll start a little bit with the spending survey. With regards to respondents, this is kind of the proportion of fly-in fly-out to not fly-in fly-out respondents. The fly-in fly-out workers are going to places like Alberta, Muskrat Falls, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And
This is in the community of Parker's Cove too, just one particular community on the Burin Peninsula that we chose to do this door-to-door spending survey. Household.
so I guess research so far has kind of focused on Parker's Cove with other teams within the community impacts component, looking at other areas like Mary's Harbor, including transshipment and construction. So from the survey data, we're kind of seeing spending. So the red dot kind of in the middle, the small red dot is where Parker's Cove is located. So we're seeing fly-in fly-out workers, which are indicated by the red spending in areas like Mary's Harbor and St. John's, so definitely in larger service centers. And the same thing is happening with the non-fly-in fly-out. Marystown, I'm sorry. I was in Labrador over the summer, so the name is in my head. Anyways, is there anything you'd like to add for the economic?
And that's one of the concerns around spending is that the spending is, most of the money is not staying in the communities where people live. It's going to
the larger centers where there's more amenities and things for them to be spent on. So I'll expand a little bit on some of the findings with regards to employment opportunities. So employment opportunities and challenges locally have come up as kind of a theme. There's this idea that if one person is hired, they will recruit more people from the region who will then go to a place of work, which might lead to some of this dependency. There's difficulty retaining employees locally. So for local small businesses, mostly because of an inability to compete with Alberta wages. With regards to spending and saving, again, we're seeing spending in larger service centers versus locally. There's generational differences that have come out with regards to spending. The idea that young people are spending more while older people are saving more. Perceptions of the ability of Alberta workers to spend. This idea that I think Kelly mentioned, that everyone who's going to Alberta is making a ton of money and they're able to spend that. And that isn't always the case, and that has come across as gendered in some of the interviews, as Heather has mentioned. And then with regards, and that again goes into this idea of income polarization. With regards to debt, the idea that the scale of purchases has changed because more money equals larger purchases, and this is particularly relevant in the case of a downturn related to resource economies. And so this is just a quote that came out of one of our interviews that kind of highlights the perceptions of mobile workers. There are questions about whether this is actually what's going on in reality. And some of the research that's coming out of the community impacts team is showing that that may not actually be the case, as I'll explain in Deer Lake. So that's just to illustrate that. With regards to housing, there's this idea that there are larger, more expensive homes being built. Upwards of $300,000, $400,000. This has led to an increase in property values, which is a concern in small rural areas. Workers are dispersed throughout communities. So in the case of Deer Lake, as I'll explain, there are neighborhoods where stakeholders are saying this is where the mobile workers are living. They're concentrated in these areas. That wasn't the case in the Burin, at least in Parker's Cove. They were dispersed throughout the community. And another kind of impact that came out under housing was this idea of the empty community. There are houses in the community that nobody's living in, whether they were family houses or it's family property, or they're building houses and they're just not there to live in them, and the kind of impacts that has on community dynamics. And finally, with regards to sense of place, there's kind of two camps that have come out of the interviews. There's this idea that sense of place is what's keeping people in the community. It's a great place to bring up kids is one of the quotes that's come out of the interviews, but this idea that people want to live in these areas because of the lifestyle it affords or because of friend and family connections. On the other hand, there's this idea that sense of place may not be as relevant if there's no employment opportunities there. So the quote at the bottom talks about going where the money is out of necessity. If they had the option to stay and there was employment opportunities locally available that would pay the same amount, they would stay. But as it is, it's not really an option. So I don't know if there's anything Kelly or Heather you'd like to add? Good.
Just on the toys, that so far we're just really starting to analyze the spending survey, but it looks like the workers who are mobile are not any more likely to buy ATVs and skidoos and things than the non-mobile workers. So that's interesting. It's just challenging some of the assumptions, because we constantly are hearing that in the kind of anecdotal discussions with people, that's what people are spending their money on all these toys. But it's not just, we're not seeing it so far in the data that it's really the case that they're more likely to be spending more money on toys than anyone else.
Related to that, we also heard that because in some instances there might be more spending on certain types of purchases, other people who are not mobile workers feel pressure to make those same purchases. So we're seeing some interesting dynamics in that regard.
So as I mentioned earlier, this case study is coming out of my own thesis research, the title of which is up on the screen, looking particularly at the built space impacts of fly and fly out employment-related geographical mobility. So that's the use of airplanes to get to and from a place of work. Heather and Kelly have both kind of talked about the different community types, so I'm not going to go over that too much, but I did want to show anyone who's new in the room where my community type kind of fits in the host source dynamic. So a hub community is a community that has mobility infrastructure, in the case of fly and fly out, and airport infrastructure that allows workers to be conducted from their home communities to their work communities and then back again. The hub community may also be a source community if it has enough stuff, according to the Australian literature, things like services, housing, amenities to attract workers and their families to relocate there or live there permanently. So the community that I am studying, we'll jump right into the research, is the town of Deer Lake in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's located on the west coast of the island of Newfoundland, just north of Corner Brook. It's a town of about 5,000 people. It does have an airport that services a large catchment area up to the top of the Northern Peninsula, so I can point that out. Over to southern Labrador, over to Gander, which is where the next major airport is, and down into Port aux Basques. And so the research kind of came out of it was really just volunteered by community stakeholders who saw that their community was growing, and they pointed to built space and said, you know, there's all these large houses going up. They're being built in this one particular region of the town called Nicholsville, and we think it's mobile workers because they're going to Alberta, they're making all this money, they're coming back and they're spending it here. So we kind of designed this research project to address these concerns. So my research had three objectives. I'm only going to talk about the bottom two today. If you have any questions about the theoretical kind of first objective, let me know. So objective B was to identify changes in built space in Deer Lake that have resulted directly from fly and fly out employment-related geographical mobility. And the second was to identify additional environmental and or socioeconomic impacts in Deer Lake that can be attributed specifically to the fly and fly out workforce. And my approach was mixed method. I used participant observation. I actually worked as an intern with the town planner, economic development officer in Deer Lake to try and understand what was going on, and it gave me access to some of the building permit data that I used to design the research project. Like the door-to-door census, which the population that we surveyed with the door-to-door census was the total number of new homes in Deer Lake, plus the total number of significantly renovated homes. So that worked out to $20,000 or more over the period of time between year 2000 and 2016. And those dates were chosen to try and encompass the rise of fly and fly out, or engagement with fly and fly out work in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we built on the door-to-door census with semi-structured interviews, particularly with key informants, but also with some residents who volunteered themselves on the door-to-door census to participate. And my data analysis is newly done, so this is kind of the first time I'm sharing it, but it was content analysis and then some descriptive statistics. So with regards to the built space impacts, it does appear that fly and fly out work has impacted built space in Deer Lake in a number of ways. This is kind of an example of some more service infrastructure and changes that have happened to accommodate a fly and fly out workforce. The Deer Lake Airport currently has 1,237 parking spaces after two very close renovations and upgrades. And this is a quote from one of the interviews that states, airports of similar size across Canada for doing the same level of traffic that we're doing would have 300 to 350 parking spaces. And so the demand for long-term parking has been attributed specifically to the fly and fly out workforce in Deer Lake. Most of the discussion of built space impacts has actually revolved around the housing, which is probably not surprising because, as I mentioned, stakeholders pointed to housing specifically as evidence of fly and fly out workers living in the community because the houses were bigger, they were on bigger properties, they look different, all kinds of things. They're more expensive, had better kitchens. So this is just a quote from one of the interviews that talked about some of those changes in that perception. Just to talk a little bit about, again, this is the survey. So we went to 633 addresses, from which we got 224 surveys back, plus an additional 50 respondents who chose not to answer the survey, but did tell us whether a fly-in fly-out worker lived in their home or not. So of those, 77 respondents were fly-in fly-out, which informs the rest of the data that I'll show you. When we went through the building permit data, all of the permits fell into 4 categories with regards to the population. So they were either new dwellings, renovations or general repairs, extensions, or garages and sheds. The far pie chart shows the fly-in fly-out address permits specifically. And you can see that the fly-in fly-out workers have impacted in each of the 4 categories. It's interesting to note that the extent of the impact is actually quite even between non-fly-in fly-out and fly-in fly-out workers. I think there was an expectation that fly-in fly-out workers would be coming in and building more houses, but it actually didn't turn out that that was the case. And in addition to that, when we looked at the average cost of these things, fly-in fly-out workers were paying more on average for their new homes, for example, but it wasn't actually significantly more. And actually, it's not included on this chart, but so the most expensive homes built by respondents were actually not built by fly-in fly-out workers, which is interesting because it challenges some, I think, of the perceptions that we've been talking about the fly-in fly-out worker and their ability to spend in the community. The other thing we wanted to address was this question of, are fly-in fly-out workers actually concentrated in particular neighborhoods? Are they going to particular areas to build their houses? As I mentioned, community stakeholders suggested they were all going to Nicholsville. And we did find that, in fact, most of the FIFO averages were in Nicholsville, but they were not the majority of any one neighborhood surveyed in Nicholsville, though there were high concentrations in some specific areas, like across the river, which is where we were told a lot of the larger houses were built and where we would find our fly-in fly-out workers. But they're actually quite evenly spread out throughout the town. So they've had a general impact as opposed to an impact in one particular neighborhood of the town, or in terms of their role in the largening of the footprint of the town. Moving on to the last objective, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but these are some of the other impacts of fly-in fly-out work that have come out of research. Economic, mostly it was positive, this idea that fly-in fly-out workers are working away and they're coming back and they're spending all of their money in the community. This idea that they're keeping the town alive came up quite often. Their support of the town in an economic sense. Demographic change, new people coming into the community, particularly out of the Northern Peninsula region, which has been declining since the COD moratorium of 1992. The changing community dynamics, the idea that people don't know their neighbors in a lot of these new neighborhoods, and the impacts that those have. Family dynamics, the idea of single parents, basically single parents. Often it was the men working away and the women staying home with kids. But there were programs, as Kelly mentioned. This one is called Home Again, Gone Again, and this is a workbook they have for children that they basically use in this program to try and provide a support for women and children whose husbands have been going away. There have been changes in services, not linked directly to a fly-in fly-out workforce, but the idea that there are more restaurants there because there's more people moving through the community. Increases in crime. I think Doug mentioned drug abuse, and that has come up with some as a concern with regards to the fly-in fly-out workforce, and impacts on volunteering, things like fire department or finding people to coach activities in the town. And just kind of to end, I think perhaps the most interesting thing that came out of the research was a very strong sense of place in Deer Lake. When we actually had a question on our survey that asked people why they chose to move to Deer Lake or why they chose to continue to reside in Deer Lake. And we provided them with a bunch of options, things like amenities, government services, access to transportation networks like the biking trail, in addition to things like access to the Deer Lake Airport. And while things like access to the Deer Lake Airport did come really strong, it seemed that the things that were actually keeping people on the island were friend and family, or at least in the town of Deer Lake, the things that were attracting them there were friend and family connections and this sense of home. We didn't provide home as an option, but it came out in the top 4 responses in the in the categories overall. People just volunteering that this is home, this is where we want to be, and that's why we're here. So these are some quotes that came out of the interviews. People obviously want to live in the town, they want to live in the island, but there's a sense that if they can't find employment locally, fly and fly out work is allowing them to stay where they want to stay, but make enough money to do so. So that obviously has some implications for sustainability. The town, I think, will probably have to continue to plan for the presence of a fly and fly out workforce as long as the people choosing to engage with that work feel like they don't have another option for local employment. It also raises questions about Deer Lake is growing. It's one of the few communities on the island that is currently growing, but it's growing at the expense of smaller communities of hundreds of people. So there's questions about that as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Leanna. And we'll queue up my slides, and then we'll open up the floor for some Q&A about some of the specific things you've heard from Newfoundland and Labrador. So just, I guess, while Michael's getting it up and ready, I can start chatting. But with the nickel, we'll start off in Long Harbour with nickel processing. And we originally started this work back in 2013. So we've gone through now, we're into our third phase. And with our first phase, we wanted to just do a preliminary investigation into both the causes of labor mobility, but also the impacts on that host community of Long Harbour in particular. Thank you. And then when we started our second phase in 2014, which just kind of wrapped up earlier this year, and it's largely based, Josh Barrett, who is a trainee, was working with us as part of his master's thesis. We were able to conduct a survey with the workers at the processing facility in Long Harbour, and so through that he was able to get questionnaire responses back from about 131 workers, and that's roughly 31% of the workforce at the processing facility. And he also conducted 21 semi-structured key informant interviews. And we're now just into our final phase where we're revisiting Long Harbour to see if things have changed and in what way. So when we actually look at where Long Harbour is, again, it's kind of just in that wider Burin region, or just before that. And it's the site of the nickel processing facility for Vale. Construction of that facility started in 2009, and at the peak, there were upwards of 6,000 workers coming into a community that was only, around 298 people, which was a max in 2011. And so you've got a lot of people coming into a very, very small rural community. When we did our first wave of interviews in 2013, there were about 175 process operators working at the facility. Only 4 were actually from the local community, and 34 were from within a 50-kilometer radius, and that's what the company uses to distinguish where the workers are coming from within 50 and beyond 50. 75% of the workers we knew were commuting from beyond this 50-kilometer radius. And the facility now has over 450 workers, and as we'll see in a few slides, a large number of them are commuting from St. John's, which is about an hour and a half one way. So looking at some of the findings from the first phase, where we really wanted to see what those impacts were on Long Harbour as a community, the first thing that came out really prominently, which Kelly and Leanna have touched on, are the housing impacts. And this, I think at the heart of it, there was several projects going on in the broader region, which was impacting both availability and affordability. So what we saw was one of the quotes was that every bed, every pillow was in demand. B&Bs, hotels, you name it, people were renting out rooms. People had trailers parked in their backyard and were renting those out to workers. But it also drove up the cost of housing, and especially rental housing. And for people on fixed incomes, in some instances, we were seeing rent go from $400 or $500 a month up to $1,400 to $1,500 to $2,000 a month, because the workers had living out allowances that they could spend on housing, and people who had rental accommodations were certainly trying to get in on that. In terms of housing responses, as I mentioned, people were renting out their own rooms individually, but the company did anticipate that demand in housing, so there was a 1,000-room camp that was built on site for workers. There was also a mini home subdivision, which you can kind of see in the top left, that was built for workers, mainly managers, and also a lodge was constructed. When we drive into Long Harbor, we often saw trailers just parked along the side of the road. Many times these were housing workers who were working either in construction, less so in the process operating side. Another major concern that they had was traffic and infrastructure, and we had a lot of people, one person described it as this train of F-150s that would leave every morning from St. John's and travel to Long Harbor and other communities with projects in that region. One of the ways that the community tried to deal with some of the traffic concerns or people speeding through town was to put up an electronic sign reminding people to slow down. They also worked with the RCMP and the companies to ensure that the safety message was getting out. There was a heightened police presence to ensure that people who were speeding, it was discouraged as much as possible. But there was also discussions about the volume that traffic, when you think of 6,000 workers, not all of which were commuting daily, but many, and even just 450 workers, which we know many are commuting from St. John's, that puts a lot of pressure on the actual physical infrastructure. But these communities aren't getting a lot of those direct benefits, say taxation, to be able to actually upgrade or maintain their infrastructure. When we look at local economic development, what we were seeing and what a lot of people were hoping was for some local investment and some local investments. We did see that people were spending those living out allowances at B&Bs, hotels, and restaurants. Some businesses did expand their operations to meet that demand. And along an area that's just kind of off the turn to Long Harbor and some of the other communities where some projects are, we have seen some business development, particularly catered to mobile people, whether it's workers or people traveling through the province, gas stations, importance, restaurants, those kinds of things. A really interesting theme that came out in the first phase was this relationship between the company and the community when your workers don't actually reside in that community and what that does. And so one person mentioned there's this big difference between the company and the effing company. If there's no buy-in from the community, then the company will always be an adversarial company. And they only buy in if you're going to get is if you have a sense of ownership. That's my employer. That's where I earn my living. That's where I look after my family. So therefore, now they have an interest in the company. And if nobody's working there, then they will have less interest in the company. Some people don't care about the company, and now it's an inconvenience to them. So really talking about how when you do have that local employer, people can point to it, you do get a sense of that community-corporate relationship, and this, in some instances, has been strained, but does also improve. So in terms of what Josh did is he was able to survey workers, and so we got a sense of where people were coming from, and we wanted to find out both why they were commuting, but also their sense of belonging to the communities that they were commuting from, and also some of their spending decisions. And just to kind of bring us back to our earlier session this morning where we were talking about the shifts, this is the cycle for our workers at Long Harbor. It's a 28-day cycle for the process operators. And it's this very interesting formula where it's 4 days on, 3 days off, and then you do nights. And so there's also a 4 days on, 4 days off day shift and a Monday to Friday, usually for more managers. In terms of the source communities, what we discovered was that 52% of the workers were permanently residing in the St. John's City region. And in the questionnaire, there were, I think, 39 different communities that were reflected in the responses where people were commuting in from, but by far the majority were from St. John's. In terms of how they were getting to the facility, most of the people, we've divided up the answers between those commuting greater than 50 kilometers and those commuting less than 50 kilometers. The majority of people commuting more than 50 kilometers were actually carpooling, while individuals that were commuting less were typically driving on their own. We then asked questions about how people would describe their sense of belonging to the community where you permanently reside. And we're interested in this because a lot of the mobility literature stresses this as one factor as to why people choose to commute and not relocate to a community, is because there's an attachment to that place where they live. And what we actually found was that it was somewhat neutral for folks that were living beyond 50 kilometers, but came up much more prominently for people who were living within that 50-kilometer radius. Even though we're talking more about the source communities, we did also ask how, if they felt connected to Long Harbour. And what we saw there is that it was pretty weak. There wasn't a lot of connection to the community itself. In terms of time spent volunteering, what we saw was 22% of the plant workers with longer commutes, so over the 50 kilometers, were active volunteers in comparison to about 54% of people who had shorter commutes. And when we looked at the factors which were influencing, we saw that 54% of those who commute less than 50 kilometers suggested that the amount of volunteer work they were doing had stayed the same since they started working at Valet, compared to about 31% of respondents that commute over 50 kilometers. So we're seeing that those who were commuting longer distances were having less time to volunteer. Again, a similar trend with time spent on sports and recreation. Those who were commuting longer distances cited that they had less time to do this. Part of the factor was that the long shifts plus the long commute meant that by the time they got home, they'd missed many of the events. They often, because they're on this shift schedule, can't commit to being on teams or participating in things on a regular basis. And they also cited in the interviews that when they are home, they just want to spend time at home with their families, and that leaves sports and rec as less of a priority. So when we did ask about time spent with family and how that's changed, we also saw that there was some decline with people who were commuting more, whereas people who were commuting shorter distances actually saw an increase in time being spent with the family. And in some of those instances, it was because people were actually able to shorten those commutes. They might have been employed by in a other sector at another job where they had to commute longer distances prior to being employed at Long Harbour. So in terms of purchasing and spending, what we're seeing is some purchases happening in that Whitbourne area, which is where the service gas station, Tim Hortons are. Big purchases happening in St. John's, so trucks, cars, things like that. People want to spend locally, but most oftentimes the stores in the smaller communities close earlier. So a lot of the purchases that we are seeing typically were happening in St. John's, or where the communities people reside in full time. So very, very quickly, we just started going back to Long Harbour to see what some of the impacts and some of the changes. And I think the most striking change that we noticed was a sharp decline in population between the previous census and the 2016 census. So we're now down to 185 people from 298. So that's quite a change for the community. In terms of some of those other pressures that we heard about, they have a new road and no more flat tires. We're very happy to report. The training facility that the company built during the construction phase was turned over to the town, and they now use it as their office as well as a community center. A housing development had gone up with prospective lots and 2 builds that were completed so people could see them when we first visited in 2013, and those 2 houses remain empty and all of the lots remain unsold. So we're not seeing a lot of people moving into the community and taking advantage of that. So in my last few minutes, we'll go north to Labrador, and we're really just in the preliminary stage of analyzing our results. In late 2016, we were approached by some community stakeholders in Labrador to discuss our research and also whether it could be extended up into the region because of some of the changes happening in the mining sector, in particular in Labrador City, but also the large hydroelectric project, Muskrat Falls, which is just outside Happy Valley Goose Bay, but a lot of the transmission line work is happening also down right through Labrador and across Newfoundland. So Kelly, Leanna, and I, we received some additional funding from the Robert Harding and Lois Claxton Humanities and Social Sciences Endowment Fund at the University of Waterloo, as well as through a VP Grenfell research grant to travel 4,000 kilometers over the summer, meeting with people on the ground in communities, talking to them about the impact of mobile workers in the Labrador Straits, along the South Shore, in Happy Valley Goose Bay and Labrador City. And so some of our initial kind of findings in this area that we're seeing was in the Labrador Straits. There was a lot of workers who are going away and working up at Muskrat in Happy Valley Goose Bay, Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and Voisey's Bay. But then all of these workers coming in to help build the transmission line. So we're seeing these two kind of dynamics happening. This was causing a huge competition for labor and a labor shortage, driving up wages, and many businesses and service industry especially turned to the temporary foreign worker program to remain open. There was also huge concerns about the impacts on infrastructure. You can see the road condition, which was partly because there was more people using the infrastructure, but also there were 60-ton trucks passing through, bringing heavy equipment to the project, and this was quite concerning for a lot of people, especially in the tourism industry, because the buses were refusing to drive on the roads. The overall view was that the impacts have only been negative for the region, except for a limited number of individuals, including businesses that are in the quote-unquote toys industry, and some of the hotels benefiting with extra money was perceived to be flowing to Corner Brook in particular and St. John's. In the hospitality sector in particular, in the Straits, what we saw was that some of the hotels were taking long-term bookings. Mainly, this is the managers who are staying in those types of accommodations. There were camps that were built for the workers. But this was at the expense of the tourism industry. And so what you can see, there's a couple of TripAdvisor reviews of one particular accommodations in the Straits, and one individual said, I had a reservation with this place until the owner emailed me saying that he could not honor it. I called only to find out that a big hydroelectric project had come to town and taken up all his rooms. He had to drop some existing reservations to accommodate the longer term business, and mine was one of them. This is disgraceful business behavior. So really impacting the tourism sector, and what some of the hotels ended up doing was blocking for their bus tours, so ensuring that the bus tours had access to rooms. But in one instance, a hotel owner actually bought herself a camp and stuck it on her property, which you can see. And so she would allow the workers to stay in that, and then everybody else in the tourism industry stayed in her hotel, and it paid for itself. In Happy Valley Goose Bay, where the Muskrat Falls hydro facility is being built, what we saw, the airport actually did interesting expansion, and they now have a mobile workforce redistribution center is the name, and it's just off the main wing connected to the airport. But this is so that workers can be processed in and out. They step off the bus, they walk through here, and they're on their charter flight in and out of the region. The addition has already paid for itself because of the number of traffic through it. We heard about challenges with our health services, where people with really complex health issues were coming in to work in the region, and that was really straining the health care providers in Labrador and Happy Valley Goose Bay in particular. We were also hearing a lot about an influx of drugs, especially cocaine, and that was also affiliated with the project and the larger incomes coming in and housing pressures as well. And then finally, in Labrador City, a really interesting case, because during the commodity boom, the union was vehemently opposed to the mines having any kind of camp accommodation in the community, and the community eventually stood behind the union and didn't want camps there. This really drove demand for housing. Companies were buying homes to house their workers. People were also buying homes in the community. It drove up costs. There was no affordable housing. People in crisis were having to be sent to St. John's as well as Happy Valley Goose Bay to access housing. And we also saw labor shortages, so the temporary foreign worker program again was accessed, especially in the service industry. Now with the bust, what we're seeing, for sale signs, foreclosures, a lot of things for sale. And the company, or I think the community is really starting to reflect on that decision to not have camps. And if there is another boom, what that might mean, and is there a blended way of trying to prevent these impacts from being felt. So we've got about 5 minutes left for questions. Maybe I'll grab Michael just so I can see if anybody online has some questions. All right, with that, we will wrap it up. Thank you so much for being with us. This is a long morning, we know that, but it was great having conversations with you. And thank you online. Yes, thanks for coming.